Okay, and breaking news here. I think I saw Malka kind of starting a sequel to a novel based on dynamometers being squeezed by people. So there's some creative work here. And everybody is doing okay out there? Tutto bene? Seguite? Okay, great. Okay, so as you see, Malka and Raffaele have been presenting you 4 issues that are both economic issues and tropes in science fiction that are just examples. Of course, there are many more, but these are the 4 that we wanted to use to illustrate the method. I'm being told that even 4 is too many. Like each of these has depth, and in order to explore in depth at least one, you guys are being asked to choose one of them. So we're going to do a quick show of hands, and based on that, we'll take the discussion elsewhere. Correct? Correct. Okay, I remind you the 4 issues. They are innovation and intellectual property rights, reputation and gift economies, automation of labor, and social reproduction. So who wants to go into innovation and intellectual property rights? Hands up. Oh, not very many people. Okay. Reputation and gift economies. Okay. Automation of labor. And social reproduction and ecological reproduction. No. Okay, it seems that we have sort of almost the same between reputation and gift economies and automation of labor. So let's repeat this. Reputation and gift economies, hands up. Only between the 2. Now you only have 2 choices. Okay, and automation of labor. Automation. Okay, we are going to go into automation. So start thinking about your questions. I get to ask the first one because I have this privileged position. And the question that I want to ask, bringing in the fact that you guys are development people. So many of you are directly policymakers, and others are people that work closely with policymakers. I would like to ask Malka, Raffaele, what about policy? So how would you go about designing a policy when you're dealing with this kind of narrative stuff? With the idea that you have in mind that communicating with the market is good for the Gambian village, therefore you try to make them communicate with the market to supplement their functioning local economy, but then their local gift economy gets disrupted, maybe as a result of what you do, even though the paper actually doesn't claim causality. So for now, it's just a correlation. How would you do that? I mean, is there any way that a policymaker cannot freeze because things are so complicated and interdependent, and everything you do is going to influence the world that you're trying the reality that you're trying to alter to begin with? Is there a way to move beyond this?
Yes, thank you. I think that's a good question, and that's actually one of the ways that narrative can be really useful to us, because in a way it is a kind of thought experiment, and it's a way of trying to play this out and focusing again not just on the sort of 2 + 2 = 4 that we sometimes get in terms of policy, where we think, oh, if we push this button, if we pull this lever, then we're going to get economic growth. But to really try to think through it in more of a narrative way, in more of a human way, and to think about the things that are going to go wrong, because that's the other useful bit of narrative, is that if you don't have conflict, you don't have a story. And so it's hard for stories to imagine that the model is going to function perfectly. But I also think if we come specifically to this question of automation of labor, that also leads back to one of the things that I was talking about in terms of getting stuck in our own context. Because automation of labor, we see this as a hot button issue all over media these days. And I think there's a degree of forgetting how much automation of labor has already happened in jobs that we have completely forgotten ever existed, like elevator operators and switchboard operators. and so many different jobs that have disappeared from the economy completely, that have had effects on people, certainly. I mean, we can't ignore that this had effects on people when it happened, but at the same time, this is not such a new phenomenon as is perhaps expressed during the hype.
Raffaele?
Yeah, let me pick up the point, the last point made by Malka. It's definitely not a new issue. The point is that we do not have to forget that is going to change not only the labor market and the production way we have right now, but also the governance rules. That is something which sometimes I think is overlooked in some way. To go back to the development issue, the picture I showed you before gives the impression that the most of the problem is on developed countries. So the states with the highest part of the graphs were the Western countries. But in fact, if you look more deeply in the issue, you see that, for instance, one economy which is going to be badly affected by automation is Mexico. Why? Because the jobs there are easily replaceable with machines, which is true everywhere. But on top of that, the demographics predict that they will have a huge increase in labor force. So that means that as a policy, if you want to give these people jobs, you have to adopt the innovation earlier than other countries. So you have to keep up with the innovation faster than Germany. Germany will not have problem because of demographics. The number of jobs are going to decrease, but the demographics is making the labor force shrinking at a faster pace. So that is important. It's an issue, but it's a complicated one because it's going to interact with governance and demographics. And if you don't combine them, you are missing the point.
If I can continue then to build on that, this issue of demographics and looking at the differential effects that come out of some of these innovations, I think is really fundamental for understanding them and also for, again, looking at the assumptions that we are taking when we think about them. If we look at the automation in the past, these jobs that disappeared tended to be jobs that were held by marginalized people who had been pushed into those jobs, right? If we think about the way computers were people who did calculations, and they tended to be women, and then computers, it became automated, and those jobs disappeared, and then computers became suddenly a very male field. So that's one aspect of it, is who is being pushed out. But there's also, as we think about that, we can also see some assumptions in terms of what those people are capable of. Because in the US particularly, for example, there's a lot of talk about automated trucks, self-driving trucks, and how all the truck drivers are going to be out of jobs. But there's a real question there for me, because with a lot of this automation, it creates different kinds of jobs, right? You can have a truck drive itself, but you need people who do the logistics to tell it where to go. Still, maybe someday we can automate that too. But so far, there's a lot of human work involved in that. And to say that truck drivers cannot shift into those jobs is making some assumptions about the people who work as truck drivers. And it's making also assumptions about what companies are willing to do for their employees. Because what that requires, of course, is training. And if we just say that it's not going to happen, then we are not holding companies accountable for their part in managing this change, which is how changes tend to further exacerbate inequalities, because the people who already have power and capital are able to adjust and use those changes to their advantage, whereas others are often left without. But one more thing on this point of self-driving vehicles as well. We think about the drivers, right? But a friend of mine who works on the question of self-driving cars, and really tries to look at the interactions between technology and the broader society, asks also, if we have self-driving cars in all our cities, what happens to municipal revenue from traffic tickets or parking violations? All of a sudden, this disappears as well. And so there are these shifts, as you said, in governance, these shifts in the way that society functions that go much deeper than just this question of employment.
Can I add something more on the? There is a nice story about the interaction between technology and institutions and the Chang paper, which I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. And the story goes that the law which forbid child labor was not independent from the evolution of technology. So he basically make a story, convince a story that child labor was made illegal because the relative productivity of child labor was overcome by the technology advances of the machines and the mines. So it was better to have adult workers, so to move kids from the mines to the schools and have adult workers able to use the machine rather than have kids in the mines.
We could afford it.
Yeah, but it was pushed by the technological advances, innovation. And that's changed the law, which means that there is a link, causal link, the story goes, from the technological innovation to institutions, which is something that sometimes we miss it.
You can tell you have great panelists when they ignore your questions and they talk about what they are interested in, which turns out to be way more interesting than your own questions. So I'm just going to roll with the punches here and to introduce another author that has taken this idea of upgrading truck drivers, except in this case it's not so much truck drivers, it's the healthcare administrators. I'm speaking, of course, of David Graeber, who is no economist, he's an anthropologist, but he's very interested in economic issues, as we know. And Graeber has this idea that our administrations are dissipative in that they cost a lot of money to run. And if you could just get rid of all these KPIs and productivity measurements and profitability, substituting them with a kind of mission orientation. Are you delivering the service? Are people happy with the service? How many people are you covering? Then maybe you could move a lot of those people that are now pushing papers into being nurses or, you know, whatever, yoga teachers or fitness instructors and deliver real healthcare benefits. So far, Graeber, what do you think?
I mean, there is plenty of organizational innovation which can be implemented and push towards the final aim and to have people working towards the real target of the organization rather than wasting their time and effort producing paper. But the health sector is exactly the sector in which the other topics come in. So there is plenty of economics showing that if you want an efficient health sector, you should push in what we call intrinsic motivation. It doesn't make much sense to have very high wages in health sector because this is not going to assure you that you have good nursing and good doctors. These are kind of professions which are chosen by intrinsically motivated workers. And as in the example of the villages, if you put extrinsic motivation in a place where intrinsic motivation are working fine, you outplace the good motivation. And you make the machine less efficient. So, and this is an organizational innovation. It's still innovation, but it's going to rely on the other topics, which is gift economies. Or at the beginning, I mean, a few years ago, the standard economists will say these are crazy people. Definitely crazy people. This was a puzzle for standard economics. But now it's moving.
I find that a very interesting observation because I've heard similar things in the NGO sector. As in, you know, well, that NGO pays a lot better, but then the people who work there are much less nice. I don't know if that's true. I only worked for a couple of them. But I think that also, as someone who studies organizational sociology, there's sort of these two fundamental principles that organization allows us to do things collectively and accomplish things that we couldn't accomplish individually, which is great, but the organization is always also going to some degree, stymie those efforts, because in creating an organization, you're creating rules and bureaucracy that are also going to kind of stifle some of that collective action. So it's hard for me to jump out of that conditioning to talk about that in more detail. But I do think that this answer and this approach bring us to kind of a flip side of the automation of labor that comes up a lot, which is the question of UBI and this of universal basic income. And this idea that, is it really so bad if we automate all the labor? If we figure out a different way for us to, this is a very lovely new trope in science fiction as well. There's a lot of people writing on this sort of thing. There are contests to get people to write about UBI, to try to make it more of a mainstream idea, because people are trying to use science fiction narratives to bring some of these ideas into the mainstream. But yeah, this idea that if we work out of our intrinsic motivation, if we don't have to work to survive, and if something else is taking care of the labor, then maybe that's a different form of economy that we can imagine.
Do you want to ask a question? They will ignore you too, but they will certainly say something very interesting. No?
Any questions before we move into the experiments? We've covered a lot of ground, so just to clarify, the 4 pillars that have been helpful, at least for me, in thinking through this are, and they're in the front of your booklet, which is your personalized little learning journey for this one. Innovation and intellectual property rights, reputation economies and gift economies, automation of labor rights, and cultural, social, and ecological reproduction. So before we move into the immersive experiments, if any questions spring to mind right now for our panelists, you are most welcome to throw them at them.
Moving on in 3, 2,
Thank you. Just a quick reflection. I've heard a little bit how economics interact with science fiction, but I'm interested to hear a bit more how science fiction uses economics in theoretizing or as the logic.
I think that when within science fiction, people are trying to build worlds that function differently somehow. Sometimes they have one idea for a single technology that changes the world, and sometimes they are looking way into the future and things are very different across a lot of different spectra. But I think for all of us, economics has become such a fundamental part of how we experience the world, that whatever world they're building, they have to take that into consideration. And they have to think about how economics changes with whatever change they're making. And then again, how that reflects back into society. So, and I think also, part of it is this idea that to have a coherent vision, have a coherent world, or a coherent future, you need to consider economics in it one way or another. But I think when I say that I write out of frustration, people write out of their frustrations or their fears. We have a lot of frustrations and fears related to economics right now. I think we're in a place where people are more and more thinking, perhaps this isn't the way it has to be. And that requires us to think about some different way for it to function. So I think a lot of science fiction writers are putting their energy there because they see some problems.
So moving on in 3, 2, 1.
And maybe just to say this might be a good time to point out that there's a reading list associated with this session that you can find
There's many resources. Anique will put them out later.
Yeah, well, it's on the back page of your booklet, exactly. And it's been compiled by the panelists, and there's a longer one on the Edgeryders platform. But that's a great segue into the next part of the session. So just before we continue, and it will involve getting up, moving away from your screens, getting into other thinking apparatuses. So I'm just giving you a little bit of a warning for those of you that are deep in your screens right now. Perhaps we can put our hands together to thank Raffaele Miniaci and Malka and Alberto Cottica. Thank you.